Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us. We're recording tonight's talk, and we will post the link tomorrow on our Network for Public Education website. You'll notice that everyone is muted. This allows us to focus on the discussion between Diane and tonight's guest, Andre Perry, without interruption. Our discussion will go until about 8:30 p.m., at which time they will take questions from you. If you would like to ask them a question, feel free to submit it at any time through the chat feature. I will be monitoring the chat to field your questions. And now that we know how tonight will run, let's get started. Diane Ravitch is the president and co-founder of the Network for Public Education. She is a historian of education and research professor of education at New York University. Diane blogs at dianeravitch.net, and her blog has over 36 million hits. She has written 11 books, including her latest, Slaying Goliath. Andre Perry is a fellow in the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institute, a scholar in residence at American University, and a columnist for the Hechinger Report. He's the author of the new book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities, which is currently available wherever books are sold. One of the reasons that Andre is such an interesting guest is that he served as the CEO of the Capital One University of New Orleans Charter Network. Welcome, Diane and Andre.
I'm particularly looking forward to tonight's conversation with Andre Perry. I've admired Andre from afar. I've read his work in the Washington Post and the Hechinger Report and in other places, and I find him so interesting. But that's only one reason I'm looking forward to the conversation. The other is that I love your book. I'll show the cover here. I know it's behind your head, but I'm going to show it anyway. Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. I loved reading the book, and I loved learning about how you became the person you are today. We also have the shared history of, I was at the Brookings Institute back in the early 90s after serving in the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, and they seemed to want to have a conservative in that slot at the Brown Center. And so that they brought me in, and then I was succeeded by somebody who came from the second Bush administration. After I went through my sort of change of view about everything that I'd been writing about and became a critic of charter schools and vouchers and testing, I found I was no longer welcome at Brookings because they had that very conservative slant to the education program, which I hope you are helping to change, Andre. We're going to talk tonight about you. And the other thing I find so interesting about you is that you did something that very few people do, and which I did, which is that you made a change in your point of view. And that's very unusual. And for the last 10 years, people have said to me again and again, why did you change your mind? They seem to find it astonishing that anyone ever changes their mind about anything. And I guess they have some kind of a mindset that they see these TV programs where two people face off and they yell at each other, and one's on the right and the other's on the left, and no one ever changes their mind about anything. So I'm interested in you because you had the ability to say, I want to take a different course. So we'll talk about that too. But I'd like to begin by asking you to talk about yourself. I found the introduction to your book so interesting. Your description of growing up in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, your unusual family arrangement. And then I realized I'm being very white-centric by saying that because I grew up in a traditional family of 8 children, mom and dad, and you didn't. But that was not your norm. It's a different norm.
That's right.
So I'd like you to talk a bit about your beginnings. And I especially want you to talk about how did you, given the fact that you didn't come from money or status or privilege, how'd you get to go to a private liberal arts college? What was it that propelled you forward? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you and talk a bit about how Andre became Andre.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, NPE. Thank you for hosting. Well, as the story was told to me, when I was born, there was a deal made with my maternal grandmother and an older woman by the name of Elsie Boyd that I would be taken from the hospital and reared by this older woman. She was 63 at the time. I'm pretty clear that my mother was probably abused, She was certainly very poor. And she already had a child. When I was born, she was about 17. She had already had a child when she was 15. And I went to this house and I was reared by this woman. My brother came along. 2 years later, my younger brother came along. But throughout my time there, and I stayed there till I graduated from high school, she reared about 12 to 15 kids of varying durations. Some would stay a few months, a few weeks, others would stay years, and my brothers and me would stay our entire time. Later on, when I was about 8, we discovered that my father, the reason why he was not around, he was in and out of prison. He was murdered in a prison outside of Detroit, Jackson State Penitentiary. He was an addict, heroin addict, and that led him to go in and out of prison. And so I was reared in this wonderful home. For some it might feel a little depressing, but I was completely loved. This older woman and her daughter Mary took care of us. We went to the neighborhood school not that far away. I had my brothers in tow. There were multiple of us walking to school every day, and and I actually became just very enthralled with school. School was one of the few places that I enjoyed myself. One little story that's not in the book, I did drop out of the 4th grade. I was getting teased a lot, and I decided to just stop going to school. My brothers and sisters would cover me, so I would walk to the library, and they would actually let me just in the library, and I would just read every day for weeks at a time. Eventually, the principal, I remember at that time, we had truant officers. It's funny when we're talking about defund the police, I always remind people there were actually a different kind of police back then. There were truant officers. Eventually, truant officer found me, brought me home, and I was, my mother, mom, I call her mom, just read to me every day. I had to repeat the 4th grade. But other than that, I lived a pretty loving household. I mean, it was everything I wanted. My brothers are doing well. My sisters, they're not my blood relative. They're doing well. And eventually, I did well in school, but I ran track. And track and field opened doors for me. It's amazing. I talk about valuing assets. And for many Black males, the one thing that we're valued about is athleticism. And so people, colleges and universities recruited me. I was very nervous about leaving home. And so I went to Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania, about 90 minutes away from my home. And there, I remember it like it was yesterday. I took a bunch of courses in my first year, and I did take I don't know if it's a policy course, but we certainly learned about the Moynihan Report. And it was there I discovered the woman who raised me was deviant. That it was there that I learned that the woman was putting me in harm's way. Of course, I'm referring to the Moynihan Report, that it did have a robust structural analysis of what's happening with Black America, but it set a horrible precedent of blaming Black women's marital behaviors as causing poverty. And I remember right then and there going, this is not true. Like I was raised because they were very cognizant of my standing in life and the economic conditions around me. At the time, I was born in 1970, and if historians or folks will know that that was the period when Pittsburgh started to decline. U.S. Steel left, and there was a lot of people out of work, and that's why my mother raised me. But that's how I got to college, and it was, and that was my first experience in policy. Now I talk about policy every single day, but it really starts from my home experience and me and my quest to validate my mother and my home and my community. There were several people in my position that were raised by grandmas, aunties, godmothers, and we were okay. It wasn't the family arrangements that hurt us. It was the devaluing of our community and of Black people that hurt us, and that's sort of the nature of my work. But I never lose sight of my work is about stating that my family, my community has value, and I will continue that work moving forward. But empirically, it holds up in a lot of ways.
Well, I think one of the things that's so engaging about your book is how you manage to bring together the personal and the policy, that you don't take just one or the other. You could have written a policy book saying a lot of the same things, but it would have been very dry.
Yeah.
Or you could have written a personal, like a memoir, and you would have gotten a different audience. But I think you use your experience in a way that's incredibly valuable for the reader, because it makes the policy come to life. I mean, the policy things you are advocating, like when you, one of the lines you use is you say there's nothing wrong with Black families and Black people in America that can't be cured by getting rid of racism. And that's a policy statement all by itself. And it leaves you in a position where you have to untangle a lot of stuff about housing and about the valuing of Black lives, but also about the biases in research. And I found that fascinating because you found out very early on that most research is done from the point of view of comparing Blacks to whites. And so then everything normal is white and Black is aberrant, right?
That's exactly right. You know, we do a lot of regression analyses here at Brookings, and it's sort of the staple of research. But there's always a referent group in those regressions, and we were trained to center white people, that they were the comparison group. The problem with that is that you essentially cast Black people as needing to catch up to white people in order to receive parity. And you put the onus on Black people for catching up. And in addition, that never leads to investment in Black people. When Black people are deemed as problems, they don't get investment. No one invests in problems. You invest in people to fix Black people. That's why in education, education is littered with white saviors. We're constantly funding white people to fix Black people so that they can quote unquote catch up. And in addition to that, all policy, all research is personal. What I do in this book is I just put my biases up front. I tell people, oh, this is about defending my family. This is about defending my community. This is about defending Black lives. I'm very clear and open about that. Unfortunately, many of my colleagues across the country, I'm not just talking about Brookings, they really take this perspective that the researcher is sort of dispassionate, removed entity that looks upon a phenomenon with clear eyes. No, everybody brings their story to their research, unconsciously or consciously. I just wish more people with privilege would acknowledge how that impacts their work, how they impacts their view of Black people. And when we do, then we could really get at what the motivation for the research is. And in education, a lot of it goes back to this Moynihan report. There are people who believe in their heart that they're helping Black people by fixing them. You know, that quote, "There's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve," gets to this notion that if you really want to help Black people, you work on policy. You don't blame Black people. And that's what we see in a lot of the reform efforts, not just the current one we're in, but previous one. They work with the assumption that Black people were broken, and ignore the large policies and the policy violence leveled against Black people and Black institutions. I know we'll talk about this in New Orleans, but it's fascinating to me how choice advocates and reformers talk about there's no discrimination, we're not racist, when the overwhelming history of education has been to coddle white choice and create systems around white choice, not to, and to the detriment of Black cities and Black districts and Black schools. I mean, you cannot remove that from any analysis, but as you know, when we talk about the need for reform, we'll go to a year, we'll say 2004, and we'll say, oh, look at the test scores in 2004, and we will ignore all the devaluation of the school district, the schools of Black people, the housing issues, the criminal justice issues, say, oh, that score is too low, we need to fix it. And it's like, no, do you know why they're so low? Because you have racist institutions, people, and leaders that have constantly devalued those things. And so for me, this goes back to the research and the motivation thing. I am very clear that there are people who will never accept me because I'm a Black researcher. I defend Black lives. I defend Black institutions. I wouldn't even consider myself that much of an educationist. What I do consider myself is as a lover of Black communities and Black people. I understand the importance of education in that, and I've chosen to work in it. But this is about honoring my family and my community first and foremost.
Well, I you know, as somebody who has spent a lot of time in the field of history, I'm very aware that when you read historical accounts, you can read things that were written 50 years ago, 100 years ago. The biases are very clear. Yeah. I mean, it's only when we read history today, we say, oh, well, this is somebody, you know, claims to be totally unbiased because we're looking at it through the current lens. But given time, or given a different perspective, historians have their biases too. But since we're the Network for Public Education, I don't want to skip over all the other important parts of your book, because I think you have a lot to say about the devaluing of Black property, which is incredibly important. And on my blog, I'm about to post something about the York City School District in Pennsylvania, which you may be familiar with. And there, the taxes have crushed the district because it's a property-based tax, and York City is poor. And so they can't raise enough money to have decent schools. And so they keep cutting the budget. The more they cut the budget for mainly Black and brown children, mainly Black children, the more they cut the budget, the more they have to raise taxes, and the more they cut the budget. And it's like a vicious, they call it a death spiral. And I'm sure this is true of many districts, particularly urban districts, small urban districts around the country that are trapped in this death spiral of not having the resources to provide an adequate education because of the property-based taxes, which is great if you're living in an affluent suburb, but not so great if you're living in a small city. To get to, I want to get to New Orleans because I've, of course, found that a fascinating chapter. And, you know, I used to be, back when I was at Brookings, was the beginning of the choice movement. And I thought choice sounds like a great idea, and charter sounds like a good idea. Why not give it a try? And since then, I've become a very outspoken critic of charters. And my turnaround came around 2007, 2008, when I realized charters were not all they were supposed to be. The promise was there, but it was never fulfilled. And one of the things that I've found very, very troublesome, I'm interested in getting your reaction to it, is the popular format of no excuses charters, which have always struck me as racist. It's white people, and particularly young white teachers who went to, in most cases, very privileged schools. And I can't figure out where they learned to be such strict disciplinarians of Black children. So since you led a charter network, you're going to have to talk about your role in New Orleans and to give us the background about how you got to this moment so that we can then talk about the point at which you started turning around on this.
Yeah, what's funny is the assumptions of me as an out-of-towner that came to New Orleans and the privileges that I've received because of that are absolutely outstanding. When I arrived in 2004, about a year before the storm, I essentially wrote about immigrant educational rights. I did write from a federal perspective. Talked a lot about the DREAM Act, about visa issues, but I wasn't a ed reform person. But after the storm, Hurricane Katrina, the dean approached me. He saw that I was working with a lot of the government agencies on the recovery efforts. He saw that I was writing a lot about education. He said, hey, you were writing about federal policy, you were writing about education. Would you like to get involved in the charter schools that we have? Now, the University of New Orleans actually had 2 charter schools before the storm. We were actually the first to actually receive a charter through the Recovery School District, the new Recovery School District legislation. And it was Pierre Capto Charter School. We had that, and there was a Nelson Charter School that was about to open before the storm. And we treated them more like professional development schools, lab schools, where we would deploy our student teachers and our faculty were working it. So it wasn't in that mode of the current, the no excuses charter movement that you saw. In addition, we had Black leaders, we had significant Black teachers. So we looked different. But after the storm, when it's been 2 years after the storm, when the national movement really descended upon New Orleans, then you started to see a pressure put on the charter providers to act a certain way, to look a certain way. The funders were funding certain types of initiatives and programs and not funding others. Ours was more of a community school model. Walton Foundation and others were like, nah, that's not what we're trying to do. We want more of this KIPP-like model. And even the board chair, Tim Ryan, I talk about this in the book. He would always say, why can't you be more like KIPP? And I was like, well, because they're doing things I don't agree with, and it doesn't fit in our mode. But the really thing that got me when I agreed to do it, the thing that really got me was when you're doing this work and you see your colleagues not hiring Black people en masse. I mean, remember that the teachers after the storm categorically were fired because you had a state superintendent that literally held money to say, we're not going to bail this district out unless they make some of these changes.
So 7,500 teachers were fired?
That's
mostly Black teachers.
It was 7,500 employees. I would say about, I think 4,500 teachers, overwhelmingly Black women across the board. So, and in total, that represented about between 3 and 5%, depending on how you slice it, of the Black middle class was eliminated. And so you had that event, but then the other part of it is the rehiring. So it's not just the firing, it's who's rehired where you see the discrimination and the bias. It was younger white women, largely from alt-cert programs, TFA. There was another, I think Teach NOLA, There were other organizations that we were drawing from, and they were at the time largely white. And so we made investments in those organizations. There was Fisher, Broad, Gates gave a bunch of money at one point, and it really elevated TFA, New Schools for New Orleans, New Leaders for New Schools at the time, really elevated their status and control in New Orleans. Now, I write a lot about community wealth and wealth. If you follow the book, you'll see I talk about restoring the wealth that's been extracted by racism. This is another example of extracting wealth from a community. When you're not hiring Black people in a majority Black city, it erodes the economic mobility of that city. We're asking to educate children so they can get jobs, but at the same time we were denying jobs to Black people. That just didn't make sense to me. So I'm in this mode and I'm arguing like, whoa, why aren't we hiring Black people? And then there was the expulsions and suspensions. You realize your colleagues are doing something when people who are suspended are coming to your school to enroll. And you see that some charter schools at the time had an overrepresentation of certain groups, of special needs group, of people who transferred. And so you could see that there were charter schools at the time that really took a much different approach. And it was the no excuses, just being mean type in schools that didn't hire a lot of Black people. And so at that point, I started going, whoa, this is home again. This is a devaluation of my family, my community. They were essentially blaming Black people for the educational woes. And it came out of the wash in who was hired. If you really wanted Black educators, if you were really trying to elevate a community, it's without question you hire Black teachers, you hire Black employees. You're in a majority Black city. You have to do this. But they were going in a different direction. And for me, that's when I was like, look, this has to stop. And I was vocal internally. Everybody knows that. I mean,
whoops, we just lost the sound.
We may have lost Andre. It looks like he's still here, but his feed seems to have cut out. Let's give him a minute and see if he can reconnect.
hello?
There you are.
Okay, sorry about that.
You were getting very passionate. You have to continue right where you were if you can remember it.
Well, I was saying I was getting very upset at the times, and really my family came back into perspective that that I felt the devaluation of Black lives. Now, when you're a Black leader, you understand this. So there are Black charter leaders in New Orleans that also are in that same position. So you always have to have that nuance. You have Black charter leaders that are hiring Black people, that are contracting with Black organizations, that are serving Black students well. And I was part of that camp. But then you had white leaders doing, I mean, unthinkable things to children and communities, and in the name of test scores. And I talk a lot about that in the book, that and I used to joke all the time, like when people used to ask me, what's the fastest way to close the Black-white achievement gap? I used to joke and say, well, the fastest way is to stop educating white people. But we would never do that. However, we have done equally nefarious things to Black people. We suspended kids, expelled kids, fired teachers, did all kind of just mean things to people in the name of raising the test scores. The ed reform has never been about just increasing test scores. It's about how do you do it? And that ethical question is something. My kid is crying. I don't know if you can hear that, but
it's okay.
Okay.
It happens.
Okay, I'm distracted, but so there's a lot of negative things happening. And at that point, I just got frustrated. I got really frustrated.
Well, you know, the probably the highest performing charter chain in the US is not KIPP. It's Success Academy in New York City. And, you know, I think Tom Sowell has a new book out, and others have said Success Academy is the one. They have closed the achievement gap. Now they've done it through draconian means. I mean, they have Eva Moskowitz, who is white, obviously, is paid close to $900,000 a year to run this place with an iron fist. And it's a no excuses taken to the ultimate. And they whittled out the kids. They don't accept new students after the 4th grade. And they whittle out the kids who don't produce the high scores. So by the time the kids reach 12th grade, they've been boiled in the cauldron for 12 years. And those that are left, I don't know how well they do in college, but it's a very, very small graduating class as compared to the number of kids who started. And it would seem as though that's a fairly reliable formula for closing the achievement gap. And that is, choose your students carefully. Don't accept the kids with disabilities other than the very mildest disabilities. Don't accept the kids who don't read or write or speak English. And then start kicking out the kids or pushing out the kids by multiple suspensions because their mother or their guardian can't come to school every single day, day after day. And so eventually they withdraw their child. And then you're left with only the children who get high scores, and you can say, voila, we just closed the achievement gap. We got rid of all the kids who couldn't get high scores. And it seems as though that's a model that some charter leaders have followed. But you have to ask at what point the question comes up, what's this race about test scores all about? And how important is it to have those high scores? And I know that even people I disagree with about choice have written that scores are not really a very good predictor of life outcomes. And yet we've made them into the be all and end all of schooling to the point where we're driving out things that kids actually like to do and actually like to study, whether it's history, the arts, science, and any number of other things that don't have tests attached to them. But I could go on with a whole long thing about testing. And I think that testing does have racial bias. Testing does have cultural bias. And it's no big surprise that when you look at whether it's the SAT scores, the ACT scores, the NAEP scores, the state scores, what you find is that the best way to predict the scores is ask what the parent income is.
Right. You know, what's interesting about that is I talk to choice folks and private school folks all the time. And I say, you know, be clear that we don't know how well private schools are doing because they filter. Like and we don't know the quality of the teachers because they don't share. And to say that it's better quality and safer, you know, you know, when you have filters to get rid of people and inherently it's exclusive, come on, it's just not it's not good for an entire community. Yes, you can have a few private schools for real reasons, but to encourage escape hatches is to accentuate the problem.
Well, some years back, I was in Chicago when I was at a small dinner where Karen Lewis, who was then the president of the Chicago Teachers Union, was there, but also Bruce Rauner. And Bruce Rauner was a very big charter supporter. He ultimately became governor, but that was after our conversation. And so we debated charters over a small dinner table. And I said, well, what about the kids with disabilities? He said, they're not my problem. I said, what about the kids who don't get high scores? Don't they deserve an education? They're not my problem. He kept saying, whoever he didn't want to educate, that's not my problem. He only wanted to educate the kids who would get high scores. And I said, and what about all those other kids? Should they end up in the gutter? What's your plan? He didn't have a plan because it wasn't his problem.
Right, and we see that today in places like New Orleans. I mean, we're so seduced by exclusivity that it's warped our sense of the collective or public good, that we look upon public things as a bad thing. But in the long run, public and the collective is exactly what we need. One of the reasons why we have such a fractured and broken financing system is because white people choose to opt out, and we built entire systems around that. And that has to stop. At some point, you need to break the sources of inequality. And the $23 billion that schools with majority white people get more than schools that are predominated by people of color is an example of how we devalue Black institutions, choices, schools, in service to white choice. And for me, that has to stop. And I'm very clear that folks who don't see the racism in all that, they are delusional. I mean, completely delusional. If you're in New Orleans, you know that Black schools, even within the district, were devalued and under-resourced by policymakers, by superintendents, by mayors. I mean, this is historic in New Orleans. And when they were forced to desegregate, folks fled to the private schools. And those are the people that we're then now saying, hey, we want Black kids to go to those institutions. No, we do not. This needs to stop. At some point, we need to prioritize public schools for the public good. There is value in that. And this individualistic, my kid, my test score, my school, that's ruining a democracy. And so there are some things we need to do together. Now, and so, I would leave it there, but I think the testing, the privatization, all of this goes into this this gumbo of devaluing Black lives, not trusting Black people. And it is so apparent and it is so obvious. But we go on, well, we just want the best for our kids. They're trapped in this school. No, they're trapped by racism. They're trapped by poverty. They're trapped by these whack financing systems. I mean, and so for me, we got to stop this blaming of Black institutions and Black people for the poor outcomes in Black cities. We just have to stop that.
Well, I don't know if you've given much attention to the history of school choice. I have, and the origins of school choice are in the South. And it began, the cry for school choice began in the late 1950s. The governors of the South said, we want school choice so that white children can choose the schools they go to, which are the ones they're already in, and Black children get to choose their schools. And of course, they assume, given the kind of Ku Klux Klan mentality of so many of the white South at that time, Black children would never choose to go to a white school because it would be too terrifying. So it was a way of fighting the Brown decision. And in the late 50s and early 1960s, school choice was the battle cry of the Southern segregationists. And I know I've had this debate a few times on Twitter where people say, well, where's the evidence of that? And I said, well, it's true. I mean, there's a guy named Steve Suits at the Southern Education Foundation Suitts, who wrote a book that came out this year. And it's a history of school choice. And it's about the historical legacy of the modern school choice movement. And its legacy comes right out of the Southern segregationist movement. It was never meant to help Black children. It was meant to keep them apart and to protect white hegemony and white supremacy. And they don't like to be reminded of that. They say, no, Milton Friedman. Well, nobody read Milton Friedman in 1955 except for his colleagues at the University of Chicago. But that's where school choice came from. And it's interesting to me because I'm a lot older than you. And for very many years, the term school choice was a stigmatized term. And it wasn't until in the early 1990s, late 1980s, early 90s, that people began to speak of school choice again and to use it as a neutral term, when in fact it's heavily freighted with this being stigmatized by its racial heritage and its segregationist heritage. So that's where the charter movement became the spear of school choice because vouchers were too controversial, but charters turned out to be the stepping stone to vouchers. We now see this in almost half the states in the country. In the voucher movement, again, like the charter movement, is portraying itself as somehow the civil rights movement of our time. As Donald Trump said, it's the civil rights movement of all time is school choice, which I said, no, civil rights are the civil rights
so that's
of our time, not school choice. But what was was there a turning point when you were in New Orleans when you said, I don't want to do this anymore, I want to do something else?
Oh yeah, I left. I just left. I woke up one day and I said, enough. I called the dean and I said, I'm just tired of this. This is not me. This is not what I'm about. I didn't get into it to hurt children. I did not get into it to elevate test scores. I got into it to elevate community, to celebrate education. And it was, what I was doing was the opposite of it. And so I remember that day, I just woke up, I said, I'm gonna call the dean. I was in a tenured position. I was tenured there. I left the position. I said, this is not for me. And so I just got overly just frustrated with the direction of the movement in New Orleans. And so I just let it go. I let it go. But I will say I've been connected to the ed reform movement, particularly Black ed reformers, because I felt that Black reformers offered a much different analysis and perspective. Now, I still am critical of my colleagues, but I do sympathize with the position. Black charter leaders they ran traditional schools before. A lot of them, they will run traditional schools after. They're just trying to find a place of their own to call home and do the work. And many of them have the kind of values that I have. And so I still stay connected to many Black reformers, but I've pretty much said, you know what? I need to focus my research on showing how education extracts wealth from Black communities, just like bad housing policy, just like criminal justice policy. Education is right there with it. And it's not just charter schools. Obviously, traditional districts are set up to privilege white districts that are middle class, I should say, wealthy areas with high property taxes. The system is built to privilege those at the expense of Black districts. But so I critique that as well. And I see that is a much more of a problem than even chartering. I mean, the school financing issues are the result of our segregated past. It's an heirloom of our segregated past, no question. And what I critique charters for is not, or at least the charter lobby, for not addressing segregation and housing and school financing. Because when you essentially say those are not the issues, in which they do say, I'm not going to work, it's too hard. I'm not going to work on segregation. I'm not going to work on housing. I'm not going to work on funding. That's too hard. Then you have no choice but to blame Black people for the causes for whatever problem you see. If you're not going to address the source, then you address the people who are dealing with it. And that's just a bad move, because we did not create this problem.
You know, you keep reminding me of different things. And you just reminded me back 2011, almost 10 years ago, I debated Wendy Kopp at the Aspen Ideas Festival. And her position was, we don't need to worry about poverty. We just need to fix schools, and the schools will fix poverty. And my position was, I think we have to address poverty because the schools can't fix poverty. We really have to go to the root of the problem, which is the disparity of income and wealth. And she was she had an audience of corporate and Aspen type people who were overwhelmingly on her side. So I was definitely speaking to the not people not on my side. And everybody loved the idea that you could just pour money into charter schools and into Teach for America, and poverty would take care of itself. Well, we've had 30 years of TFA, and we're still waiting for that miracle to happen. But I think that this has been, to me, one of the great disappointments of the charter movement has been changing the subject. So we don't talk about racism because we can't do anything about that. We don't talk about segregation. We can't do anything about that. What we can do is open charter schools. And that brings me to another thing you reminded me of, which is that when I changed from being on the conservative side to where I am today, I left a lot of very lucrative gigs. And I didn't care because I couldn't do that anymore. And there's all this money coming in from Gates, from Broad, from the Fisher family, from Reed Hastings, and all that money is flowing. And to walk away from that is very difficult, I would think. I was very lucky. I just reached a point where I couldn't do it anymore. But I don't see very many people leaving the reform gravy train, because I know it's a gravy train. I was myself a small part of it.
But you know what's interesting, you know how many silly, ignorant folks will say, "Oh, he's paid by the unions," and
I know.
which is crazy. I mean, you know, I still get paid by reform. I mean, you know, just as people, you know, hire me to give a book talk or contract with me a book talk, more reformers give me more of those gigs than anybody else. I mean, that's the crazy part is that oh, he's in bed with the union, he's in bed with all this money. Actually, reformers actually invite me to talk, invite me to give lectures, more so than anyone else. And so I will say, I don't think I tell people all the time, you won't die by leaving this role. Mm-hmm. Trust me, you're not going to go away. You actually may have a better voice. And now actually, for the first time in a long time, I'm really penetrating with my colleagues, with my former colleagues. They're now saying, you know, this rhetoric of poverty doesn't matter. That's clearly a falsehood. That
it only matters if you have a lot of, I mean, it doesn't matter if you have a lot of money.
That's right. That's right. And the crazy part, I joke with people, we're always asking kids to act middle class without giving them middle class money. You know, it's a different perspective. But I think you also touched on something I say all the time. This idea that if you could only fix the school, everything else will solve itself is ridiculous. I mean, schools are a part of a larger landscape of institutions. It's an important part. It does a lot. But if housing is terrible, schools are going to be terrible. If you have a criminal justice system that's drawing money, extracting wealth and people from the community, schools are going to suffer. You know, schools are not the be all end all of a community, but this idea, and you said it, people say schools are the education, the next civil rights issue of our time. It's like,
School choice, school choice.
school choice. And it's like, that is ridiculous. I mean, and so, you know, people really compartmentalize school choice in a way to service whiteness. It is always, school choice has always been about white choice. Not, it's about being able to say, I don't want to educate with these Black people. I want that option. That's been such a part, and you know, I spent a significant time in the South. That was the South. It was built on those premises. So we've got to attack those structures. And I don't care if I offend, particularly choice reform advocates who take issue with me saying that these things are racist. They are racist. I mean, they are plainly racist. We the same way we treat Black people in terms of arresting them, suspending them, expelling them, punishing them, we treat Black districts like that. We take them over. We remove board members. We do everything mean that we do to Black people, we do to Black institutions. It is racist. It is rooted in racism.
You know that the only districts that are ever taken over are Black controlled districts.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. And in this idea that that's what has to be done. We could never imagine a period if there was a tornado in Kansas. Could we ever imagine a situation where we said, let's replace all the Black teachers, I mean, all the white teachers in Kansas and bring in Black ones? That would never happen. It would be like, that would never happen. But it happens in Black districts because racism is real.
The sad thing is that maybe it's a predictable thing is that takeovers have never been successful.
Right.
And there have been many districts that have been taken over. And then we have the places like the Memphis and Tennessee Achievement School District, total failure. And other states have copied the Achievement School District, total failure, because takeovers don't work. You take power away from the local community and you remove any sense of agency, and it doesn't, nobody gets helped by that. But I want to get, before we turn over to the questions, ask you something else. One of the members of our board is Jitu Brown, whom I dearly love. And Jitu and I have had debates one time on stage in Louisville about integration. And he said, well, integration wasn't that important to him, but he thought what was more important was to build up the Black community and the sense of strength of the Black community. And I, having been born in Houston and lived and gone to segregated schools, I've always cared a lot about integration. And I'm thinking, is Jitu right? And you know, where should I stand on this? I don't know. I want to see integrated schools because I think we have to interact in order to take away people's fear of one another. And
well, I
want an integrated society.
Yeah, you know, I'm a big proponent of integrated schools because I know the sources of inequality is in segregation. When you segregate, Black districts lose. Now, that doesn't mean, and this is where certain reformers are completely off. No one is saying that Black kids need white kids in order to learn. What we're saying is that the systems that facilitate segregation ultimately lead to the a defunding of Black schools. And so where there, so we do need to talk about school financing in ways that eliminates these zones that privilege some and burden others. Now, the interesting thing is that there are lots of areas in which that we can integrate. And I have actually said, we can use chartering in a way that really makes sense. If you put a charter school that is not relying on school zones and you put them in between a Black district and a white district, I would be for that. get the willing to integrate a school in places where there's been decades of segregation. I would be for that. That's an innovation that actually addresses a problem. And so I'm for integrated schools. What I'm not for is saying is that we have to wait for integration to happen to give Black districts what they need. So for me, integration has always been more about school financing than it is other things. But with that said, we are seeing right now, we're living in an era that is the byproduct of us living segregated lifestyles. White people honestly cannot see the value in public schools and Black people. They cannot. It is hard for them to see, by and large. There are some that can see it. But by and large, it's like when you talk to some folks, it's like, well, that's good, but I don't want to risk my child, as if poverty is a disease, that you're going to catch something. You know, it's like that has to stop. And so for me, that stops when you learn with others. You know, one other thing I have to say, there is a structural change that I think we don't talk enough about. And that is, and this is in your area, history. You know, one of the reasons why folks are so locked into this exclusion as a way towards school improvement is that we really don't understand slavery, Jim Crow racism, discrimination. We really don't understand the harm it has caused over time. And I fault many state departments of education for not advancing curriculums that give us the kind of education that dismantles that thinking. Now, I can't control what families teach their children, but I do know what schools have an obligation of doing. If you don't know the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, if you don't know Frederick Douglass, if you just learned about Juneteenth, you know, something was wrong with your schooling. Let's close that education gap, that gap that is literally causing people to devalue Black lives. And so for me, I'm like, you know, we got to work on that curriculum side. This is not about what's wrong with Black districts. If there's education that needs to be handled, we need a whole lot of white people to learn about Black people and Black history, and history in the United States. And that's, you know, I'm a big fan of the 1619 Project for that reason. It's really getting us to see that there are different narratives to this. Like the you know, some of these choice people will say, look, this is what Milton Friedman said. Come on now. It's like that is, I mean, that's like saying, look what Abraham Lincoln did. You know, that's crazy. You know, we need to have an education so that we can unhinge the preconceived notions that we have of Black people. And that starts with history. We just don't know enough.
I think you're right. And I'm not going to let Darcy stop me right now, because I want to say a couple of things. First of all, what you described is a case for chartering might be a school in between two districts that would draw both Black and white kids. That can be done in a public school.
You're right.
I mean, the nature of a charter is that it's not run by a democratically elected school board. And there have been good school districts that have done a good job. It used to be Wake County, for instance, had the best integrated schools in the country until they elected a really bad public school board that eventually got kicked out. But I think that this takes me back to a point you made, and that's about crucial, the common good. And that's what we have lost right now in this time of intense individualism. And you see it with the handling of the coronavirus, where the president says, it's not my responsibility. Everybody's on their own. I'm not going to wear a mask. Want to wear a mask? It's up to you. I'm sorry. That's not the way you conquer a virus. I mean, nations all over Europe and in Asia have actually flattened the curve to the point where they're reporting single-digit deaths every day. And our death rate is going up. Our infection rate's going up because everyone's left to their own devices. And what we don't have now, and which I hope we will recover, is a sense of we are one people. We have a common destiny. We're all different. We come from different backgrounds. We have to know each other, know our histories, but we're one people. We're in the same boat. And if the boat goes down, we all go down together. And it's that sense of commonality, that sense of social responsibility that I think is lost in the, I'm going to take care of my kids and you're on your own.
Yeah, I cannot agree more. It's really eroding any semblance of a democracy, of social cohesion that we have. And that's why I've had it up to here with choice advocates, because they honestly don't, they really don't see beyond themselves. And and that is very problematic, very problematic.
Well, now
Okay.
I think we're going to turn over to the questions now.
Yay! I didn't think you were going to let me get in there, Diane. It is, you guys are having a fascinating conversation. I don't blame you for not wanting to.
Well, I'm having such fun. I didn't want to let you.
I understand. I fully understand. But we do have folks who have questions for both of you. So I'm going to turn it over now to Marla.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Diane. Very, very amazing conversation. And we have a lot of really great questions. So here we go. Okay, Andre, this one is for you. It is from Jennifer Robinson Mangrum, and she's from North Carolina. And she's running for state chief of education in North Carolina.
Oh.
And she says, Andre, if I win in November, I will be the state chief of education in North Carolina. What is the first thing I need to do to move North Carolina forward?
I can't remember the update on that lawsuit in North Carolina that required, correct me if I'm wrong, that required the the state to create a new funding formula, if I'm correct.
Yeah, the Leandro.
Leandro. There you go. There you go. I think I'm a big proponent of states have to change their funding formulas. They also have to eradicate any kind of voucher program that they may have. If you want to go to a private school, then pay on your own dime. That should not come from public resources, period. We also need, as I mentioned, change the curriculum so that history courses are updated to reflect a more accurate history. I do believe we need some type of new teacher recruitment effort, that we need more Black and brown teachers. And we say that all the time. I don't see the investment in the recruitment. And so those are this concrete things I think a state chief can take on. And each of those would be, in a place like North Carolina, a difficult haul to do those things, but it's very achievable.
Great.
Let me just add that, Marla, that you were talking to Jen Mangrum, and
yeah,
NPE
have advice for Jen?
Yeah, and NPE has endorsed Jen for state chief, and we think that we're hoping that there's a wave that sweeps her into office and sweeps out one of the most reactionary legislatures in the South.
And what advice would you have for Jen, Diane, if she were to win?
Jen knows that she can call or email me anytime, and I'll be happy to help her. I was on a Zoom with her and her supporters across the state the other day, and I think the first thing she has to do is win, and then she has to begin to really restore the prestige of the teaching profession, because the legislature has done its best over the past decade under Tea Party control to demoralize and harm teachers, and to take away their salary bumps, to replace career teachers with TFA. And it's been a long slog, and I think that restoring the dignity of the teaching profession, it would be a good start, and I would add that to all of the good ideas that Andre has.
Okay. Okay, Andre, this question is from the Reverend Charles Foster Johnson. He is the executive director of Pastors for Texas Children. And he asks you, how do we get funders and philanthropists off privatization, for example, charters and testing, and fully behind locally run, communally contextualized neighborhood and community public schools?
Yeah, you know, I think that we need to put pressure on philanthropy to do so. You know, let's not forget that a lot of the uprising that has pushed corporations and police forces and municipalities to change, they can also push philanthropy to change. That so we got to put pressure on philanthropy in the same way we put pressure on other people, that to say that we don't want this. And many, particularly many of the living donors, they don't want that kind of shame. Trust me when I say that people will switch up if people demand change. The problem is, and this is a real problem, so many schools, and charter schools in particular, so many are dependent upon philanthropy. So many have lost their voice. And even districts oftentimes give philanthropy an outsized sense of respect that, you know, in many cases it's a drop in the bucket, but because the districts are struggling for resources, they take money oftentimes in ways that they don't want. And so again, for me, this goes back to school funding. Schools should not be reliant upon philanthropy. There's a role there, particularly around you want to try something new, you want to develop something. I think philanthropy has a role there for research and development. But when it gets to the everyday operations, you know, we need to fund schools properly.
And Diane, would you want to springboard off that?
No, you go ahead and ask questions of Andre. We have a rare opportunity to have him here.
Yes, I know. I know. Andre, this is from Carol Burris. Carol is, yep, she's with us tonight, but she's babysitting, so she's watching. But she asked, if you were in charge of New Orleans schools today, how would you transform them?
Oh, if I had the power, I would really create the bring the district back. You know, you're starting to see this New Jersey. You know, we got to get the district back. You know, it went through the motions. We got to get, you know, a cohesive system back. And particularly this time when we're talking about states going into austerity modes, you know, from a business perspective, you need to centralize at times. You know, there are times you really do have to centralize, and this is at the time. And so, you know, schools and many different schools in New Orleans, I think they just decided upon a common calendar to work together more recently. But why not just become a cohesive district again? You know, as Diane mentioned, many of the things that you can that were desirable charters you can do in a district. I mean, you know, and it's kind of funny. I actually thought when I first got into it that we were actually going to provide a different product. Charter schools look like every other school. I mean, like traditional schools for the most part. I mean, the claim is, I think Matt Candler of New Orleans says this all the time, that the charge was that they wanted to do schools better than traditional schools, not necessarily anything different. And so that's just really not all that compelling, and Matt would agree with that. And so we need to go back to a regular district, and if I had the power, I would, no question.
Awesome, great. Okay, this is from Facebook. We have a couple of questions from people from Facebook. This is from Stephen Boyle, and he's talking about moving funding of schools away from property taxes. This has continued to underfund poor community schools and abundantly fund wealthy community schools. Can we best pursue changing this at the state level than the federal level? What are your thoughts?
No, I mean, but I think the issue is more of the where the money goes. You can conceive of a central repository where property taxes go, where the state that distributes funds to district with a racial equity lens or based on need versus monies going to that particular neighborhood or district. So I mean, my appreciation is more about instead of having property taxes benefit a particular region, they can benefit the entire state as a whole. We don't necessarily have to use the typical school zones like we have in the past.
Great. All right, and another one is from David Bloom. And David says, hi there. My question is about how to talk to those who say, I just want what's best for my child, or I just want to do what will draw more students into my school. What do you say to parents and teachers when they don't see education as a collective endeavor, but instead as an individualistic pursuit?
Well, you know, and that's very hard because people, they hold their child and their life as sacred as anything else. I just think that, and this is one of the goals of the book, I want people to see that one choice here negates another choice later. That you think you're saving your child. In the case of New Orleans, it's clear. We fire teachers. We expel kids in the name of test score growth, you know, when in fact their futures were hindered because of that. You know, so so for me, it's about showing people the trade-off of many of the decisions. And I think there's just a lot of mythology, particularly around, I'll stay on private schools. There's a lot of mythology about how good private schools are. No, they're more, they're exclusive. And many, I mean, in Louisiana, let's be clear, the state of education in Louisiana didn't occur just because public schools alone. Like these Christian schools where dinosaurs are walking with children. And I mean, there are horrible private schools that, particularly that vouchers fund. You know, what's interesting that you could actually make a much stronger argument for vouchers if all private schools were open and you were saying you're giving families $25,000, $30,000. That would be probably more compelling, I mean, in a way. But, you know, the reality is many private schools are bad schools. And this is the other thing I just need to be clear. If you're a Black child and you go to a white private school, often those children are traumatized in those environments, traumatized. So I'm like, look, you got to think about where did I learn that public schools are bad? The same way a lot of people think public transportation is bad or public anything is bad. Public hospitals are bad. That's been indoctrinated into us. And we need to break that. But it's just hard to compel someone when they say, it's my child and that's all I care about. But from my perspective, so the way I was raised, I believe in family, even if I'm not related to them. So it's out of this very selfish notion of family and community does that kind of action take place. If you have a broader conceptualization of family, of citizenry, of membership, oh, you go public school all day long. But if all you care about is yourself, then that's the route you're going to take. So, but it's hard to compel anyone in that situation.
If I can chime in, vouchers are never enough to allow children to have the same choices
Right.
that rich people have. I mean, this is part of the great hoax. And Betsy DeVos always says, oh, why shouldn't all children have the same choices as the wealthiest children have? Well, if that were the case, they'd be giving vouchers for $40,000 or $50,000. But the vouchers, in fact, are somewhere in the range of $4,000 to $6,000. Right. And if they're very generous, they might be $7,000. But that's only going to be enough to go to a very poor religious school. And in all likelihood, it will be a school where they're using a curriculum that is out of, there are these Christian curriculums where kids are learning that people and dinosaurs walked the earth at the same time, where they learn racism, where they learn sexism, where they learn to hate people who are different from themselves. And in Florida, for example, they have a very robust voucher program. They spend $1 billion a year on vouchers, and there's no accountability whatsoever. The children in voucher schools don't take the test. They don't have to have the same curriculum with the same standards. The state is very tough on public schools, and even the charter schools, which get $3 billion, have to take the same test, but the voucher schools are completely excluded from any accountability, and they just enacted yet another voucher program, despite the fact that their state constitution says that no public money shall go to religious schools. Right now we're on a very slippery slope heading towards funding religious schools, which is scary because today the Supreme Court came out with a decision saying that if you're an employee in a religious school, you have no rights whatsoever. They can fire you on gender basis or on any basis they want. They don't have to have a reason. You cannot claim, if you claim discrimination, they can fire you for claiming discrimination. So we're creating a very scary situation where people could be discriminated against by race, religion, gender, whatever it is. But if it's a religious school, it's okay. And they will be publicly funded.
Crazy.
Okay. All right, this is another one from Facebook, Ed Johnson, and he says, I agree that public schools cannot be all to end all. However, might public schools be perhaps the highest level point to catalyze institutions systematically to go in that direction?
So can you repeat that? I'm not quite getting it.
Yeah, it's from Facebook, so it's a little convoluted. He says,
if it's Ed Johnson from Atlanta, he's fabulous. He is the leading critic of the Atlanta School Board for its love affair with privatization. And he's a systems thinker. So there you go.
So he said, might public schools be perhaps the highest level point to catalyze institutions systematically to go in that direction?
Well, I will. Well, how I'm going to answer that question is, what I did learn as a charter school leader is how connected I was to other systems. That I know this is interesting. When you're a school leader in a low-income district, you get the calls from parents to ask you to get their lights turned back on. Yeah. That you understand the role public transportation plays in the lives of parents and children, so that they can get to work and children can get to school. You deeply understand the economic environment, the criminal justice system, all these things. When you are in that seat, you see the systems. And that's another thing that was frustrating for me. We were kowtowing to the time to Bobby Jindal and many charter leaders, because we were afraid that he was going to cut off many charter schools and voucher leaders. And so we didn't say anything when he cut higher education budgets, when he expanded the criminal justice system, when he did all these other things that hurt Black people. And
charter close down the mental health clinics.
Mental health clinics. I mean, there were all these things that he did, and the charter community stayed silent. And it was like, wow, how, like, we had a charter organization at the time, and I was like, look, we've got to say something, but no one would say anything. And it was like, you must not understand where our children are coming from. And again, it's personal. I had a father murdered in jail. I know what it's like to lose a person in a family because of unjust policy. And we have that every day. So when you are when you're at a school and you are a school leader, you have the opportunity to create connections with other systems in ways that can help children. But many are taking this perspective. I'm going to keep my head down and I'm just going to work. And it's like, man, this is so myopic, short-sighted, and this bad thinking. But it all goes back to this: if we can only fix the schools, everything will be okay. No. Kids don't live in schools; they live in communities. And when we develop communities, schools will improve. Like what? And it's so hard for us to get that. Kids don't live in schools; they live in communities. They live with families. And we need to bolster them. It's no surprise that middle-class families have better outcomes. Like there's no shock there. But yet we keep literally punishing children for the state they were born in and for the environment they were born in. And we got to enrich that environment, invest in those communities, and not just level this policy violence against students and schools as a remedy for the community.
Andre, we have, oh, sorry, Diane.
I was just going to add on to something Andre said about the devaluating of things that are public. And I used to have a debate years back with one of my very conservative friends who said anything that has the prefix or the adjective public in front of it is bad. Public housing, public transit, public this and public that. And I would counter with saying, well, what about public beaches and national parks and the air we breathe and clean water and all of these things we think are very valuable? Public pays for a fire department. Should we each have our own fire hose? I mean, there are a lot of public things that are really important. Why does everything public have to be bad? But we've had a systematic devaluing of whatever belongs to all of us. And right. So public school got swept up in this, and yet somewhere between 85 and 90%, probably 88% of the kids in this country attend public schools. 6% are in charter schools, but they get about 70% of the publicity, and maybe another 8 or 9% are in private schools. So somewhere in the up 85 to 88% are in public schools. Public schools made this country. I went to public schools. Andre, I'm sure you went to public schools. Lots of people went to public schools, and we have been, up until the past few years, a fairly successful country. Although we've been horrible on race relations, we still have to improve our public institutions and not destroy them.
Andre, with the last couple minutes that we have left, could you tell our listeners where they can get your book and how they can access that?
You can get the book anywhere where books are sold. Know Your Price. I would recommend, if you can, purchasing local. If you can, go to a Black bookstore if you can. But you can get it anywhere. You can get it Amazon. But if you can, order from a local vendor.
Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Darcy, I think.
Alrighty, yeah. I mean, actually, I would love to give Andre just the last few minutes to tell us a little bit more about the book, because we talked a lot about you and your thoughts and your opinions and policy positions, which has been fascinating. But I would love for you to give us, your 2-minute pitch on the book.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you about how I named it Know Your Price. My favorite play in the whole wide world is Two Trains Running by August Wilson. In the play, the main character, his name is Memphis, is about to have his property seized through eminent domain by the city of Pittsburgh. The city offers him $15,000. And he says, no, I'm not selling my restaurant for $15,000. I know my price. I got my price, and I'm paraphrasing. But it's a refrain throughout the play. There's another character. His name is Hambone. he paints a fence for a proprietor in exchange for a ham. He paints the fence, he never gets his ham. Throughout the play, he says, give me my ham, give me my ham, give me my ham. And we don't know if he had mental illness before he painted the fence, but he certainly goes crazy and dies demanding his ham. But there's actually a happy ending. I know people are like, damn, that's pretty sad. But there's a happy ending. The main character, Memphis, gets $35,000, well above the asking price. But it's assumed he's getting the white rate. But the moral of the story is you better know that you have value. But my book is about giving people the price to stand on. You know, as we move forward in the school reform stuff, that I'll never forget New Orleans, because there was evil and damage done when Black people did not have the ability to stand up. And, you know, I'm going to give people who know that their school is valuable, that their teachers are valuable, I'm going to give them as much information so they have the ability to take a stand, even if it means going crazy and dying, because that's what it's going to take. Because I just want to be absolutely crystal clear. There are evil people who are trying to destroy public education. Evil, racist, evil people. And I have limited tolerance for the euphemisms, for choice, and all this other stuff that is really just slogans to cover for anti-Blackness. You know, so I want to give people who do know their worth, but I want to give them the information so that they can stand up and get their ham, get their price.
Well, thank you for that amazing take on what your book is about. And I'm going to absolutely buy it tonight. I'm going to find a Black-owned bookstore to buy it from. And I'm going to buy it from my fellow school board members and my superintendent so they can read it too.
Yes.
Because you're delivering a powerful message and it needs to be heard more widely. And I'm so glad that you are here with us tonight to have the conversation with Diane and allow the rest of us to listen in and ask you questions and pick your brain.
And can I say just one more thing?
Absolutely.
One more thing. I just want to say that thank you, Diane and NPE, Carol. You're doing great work. Great work. Do not let these folks distract you. And I also will say, I mean, this is what I am clear about. You know, we all need to do internal work, and particularly white leaders. They need to do that internal work to see how they are devaluing. But, you know, I value what you're doing. I'm cheering you on. But thank you. I first saw Diane in Dillard University, I want to say in
2010.
2010, that's exactly right. And that's when I was like, okay, who is this one? Like I knew about you from the administration, and I said, okay, who is she? And then when you gave a speech, I was like, ah. So when you asked me, you know, when did I change? You know, you were a part of that, because I said, you know, she's on to something. She was a part of, she helped construct this. And now she's deconstructing. And I was
Andre,
like,
can I share a memory from that night?
what's that?
And it's the one thing that always struck me. Well, one is I met a couple, a Black and white couple who'd started a firm called Plessy and Ferguson.
Yeah. That's right.
Okay, and I love that. But the other thing was there was a woman in the audience who got up and said, first they stole our democracy and then they stole our schools. And I've never forgotten that.
Oof.
So you've never forgotten anything. I don't know that I've ever met anyone with such an incredible memory. Andre, can you believe that she could be like, yep, 2010, and here's who was
Yeah,
there.
that's exactly.
It's
Well,
Exactly.
Andre, thank you so much, and thank you for your kind words. And you better be careful because NPE might come after you. We want you.
All right.
All
Thank
right.
you so much for joining us. Andre, thank you for being
Thank
with
you.
us. We really appreciate it. Good night, everybody.
Okay, good night. Bye-bye.